Let me have a hug. Well, first, let me thank you all so much for inviting me to speak here this evening. It is such a great privilege to speak with you, my friends, my brothers and sisters in liberty, for being there alongside your fellow patriots during this long 3.5-year battle to reclaim America, to reclaim the Republic for the average, everyday American citizens. Now, you were there 3.5 years ago on that rainy Alabama day in February of 2009 when this noble movement began here and in 50 other cities across the country. On February 19th, 2009, there was no such thing as the Tea Party movement. Then, a clarion call to action came from an unlikely source, and you remember it, I am sure. It was Rick Santelli's YouTube. How many people saw that? We virtually all saw that. And millions of us throughout the United States who until then had reacted to all of the usurpations of liberty that had been going on in what we thought was solitary isolation. After that YouTube hit, we realized that we were not isolated. Our reaction to the audacious and unconstitutional grabs of power, first in the Bush administration with the TARP bailout, then the auto bailout, and then the Obama administration with that financially reckless $800 billion stimulus package, we realized that we were not isolated. We were not in the minority. In fact, we were and we are the majority. You Rainy Day Patriots, a dozen or so of you, gathered on the side of the road on that wet and dreary Friday, February 27th, 2009. You remember it? And you held up those signs that you'd handmade that expressed what would become the core values of the Tea Party movement to some passing motorists. Some stopped, some would honk, some would speed up and try to hit you with the water. But most people were paying attention to your message. And what was that message? You articulated 3 core values that reflected the constitutional covenant upon which this republic was formed more than 2 centuries ago. Constitutionally limited government, fiscal responsibility, and free markets. Now, 3.5 years later, I bring good news to this gathering of the Rainy Day Patriots. 110 days from today, on November 6, 2012, we are going to hold an election day Tea Party like this country has never seen before. And we conservatives will defeat Barack Obama. We will take back the Senate, and we will keep control of the House of Representatives. And you in this audience tonight, along with millions of other individual Americans, acting independently or acting as part of the thousands of other groups just like this tonight, meeting in the 50 states around the country, you are going to help make that happen. Simply put, this election is about one thing and one thing only. Shall the American Republic continue to survive as a government in which the rule of law protects individual liberties and constrains the power of the state? Or shall the political elites who currently control the federal government be allowed to destroy our American constitutional system and replace it with a 21st century nightmare government in which the divine right of the state replaces the sovereign right of the people? My answer is clear. Our long national nightmare will soon be over. And those of you of a certain age know the origin of that phrase. The story of civilization can be told in the conflict between the individual's desire for liberty and the state's need to establish social order. Every government, once established, seeks to centralize and consolidate its power at the expense of individual liberty. This is as true for a democratic republic like ours as it is for a constitutional monarchy like England, an absolute monarchy like France was in the days of Louis XIV, an oligarchy, or a dictatorship. From the moment the citizens of a country bind themselves in a constitutional covenant that guarantees the rights of the individual and defines and limits the powers of the government, the battle lines are drawn between the faithful defenders of the covenant and those who seek to corrupt it. This election is such a battle. We here in this room tonight, we are faithful to that covenant. Barack Obama and the allies he has are in the middle of corrupting that covenant. It will not happen on our watch. I use the term covenant. What do I mean by that? Well, there are two concepts here that are interrelated, and they both have their roots in the English traditions of the rule of law, constitutionalism, and individual rights. The first concept, that of a covenant, that has its origins in Christian theology. The 1500s and the 1600s, found first in England and then soon thereafter brought to British America. By the 1600s and the 1700s, this religious concept soon had a secular counterpart, and that's what we'll talk about in a second. The second concept is the sovereignty of the people. That is, the moral and legal authority of any government arises only from the willing consent of all the people given in a national political process. Now, in the religious context, in both the Old Testament of the Bible and the New Testament, we see the notion of a covenant as a formal and solemn agreement, a contract, if you will, between God and man, freely entered into by both parties, in which mutual promises are made. Man promises to obey God's law as communicated to him in the words of the Bible, and God promises everlasting life to man. Now, you've heard, I'm sure, of the covenant between God and Abraham, and the covenant between God and Moses. A lot of people talk about the covenant brought by Jesus in the New Testament. In the 16th and 17th century, the first Protestant reformers who rejected the theology of the Catholic Church, and let me remind you, at that time, this was a theology very closely intertwined with every European monarchy. There was no such thing at that time as separation of church and state. In Europe, in the 17th century, the monarchy, the government, and religion were intertwined and indistinguishable. But these reformers took the notion of the religious, theological, Christian, and Jewish notion of a covenant, and they took that even further. The members of every local church, they argued, had the right to form their own covenant of worship. First, a few would set forth some general principles of faith and local church governance. Then, any Christian who agreed with those principles was free to sign, using their own free will, sign that covenant of that church, and they have promised to abide by the terms of that covenant. You all have heard the term, one denomination, Free Will Baptist. That's where it comes from, Free Will Baptist. You join it of your free will. Now, it wasn't too long before many thinkers, I point now to a fellow by the name of John Lilburn. Remember that name. If you've not read about John Lilburn, go and read about John Lilburn, the first libertarian. In the 1640s in England, he was a hero of what was called the Leveller movement. These were the first to call for sovereignty of the people. And his contemporary and friend was a fellow we know well here in America, Roger Williams, the English-born American who worked under the great English jurist, Sir Edward Coke, the man who challenged the tyranny later of James I. Williams was the man who founded Rhode Island. These men began to articulate this notion of that a covenant should be applied to the secular world of governance, and that it should go hand in hand with the notion of the sovereignty of the people. And here, I don't just mean some of the people, right, which was the case in England at that time. Only 5% of the people could even vote for Parliament, the lower house. I mean the American idea of all the people. Well, the roots of our own constitutional covenant can be found in these English traditions of these rule of law. Now, it's very interesting because those traditions were challenged in the early 1600s with the rise of a tyrant king during the time of Shakespeare. I speak now of James I. Shakespeare lived and wrote during a tumultuous three-quarters of a century period of English history that began in 1558 with the reign of Elizabeth I and ended in 1625 with the death of James I, her successor. Now, Elizabeth was a wise monarch, and she understood that as queen, her power was not unlimited. She operated what was called the English Constitution. Now, when you hear that term, English Constitution, it's not the single written document that we have here in the United States, but it is rather the customs, the mores, the centuries of common law rulings that defined the division of powers between those three estates that governed England at that time: the monarchy, the wealthy or aristocracy, and then the rising gentry, which was largely represented in Parliament. In those times, the common people didn't quite have the same representation we have today. This is what's interesting. This is what it all turned. It all turned, and a challenge arose. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the change that took place in England as James VI of Scotland became James I of England was dramatically illustrated by a very troubling event that occurred as the new king traveled from Scotland south with his entourage to London for his coronation. A thief had followed the caravan down from Scotland. And at a place in northern England called Newark-on-Trent, the thief was caught. The thief confessed to the crime of stealing purses. James I had him hung on the spot. Now, this unfortunate criminal, though he may have been a criminal, and with the confession perhaps he probably was, he was provided neither hearing nor trial by jury, the rule of law that would certainly have applied had the incident occurred during Elizabeth's reign. The new king's subjects took note. This was a very different ruler from Elizabeth. In fact, James wrote a book called The True Law of Free Monarchies. And he set forth a doctrine of the divine right of kings. Now, I say divine right of kings because you're going to see this doctrine is eerily similar to something we see going on today. James argued that his authority as a monarch derived directly from God in an apostolic succession that extended back to Jesus himself. Monarchs, he said, owed none of their authority to the aristocracy, to the gentry, or the common people. The monarch was accountable not to the people, but to God. And he, the monarch alone, was the arbiter of God's will. The people were accountable to him, not the other way around. I have to tell you, sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, Shakespeare, it may surprise you, was deeply fascinated by the concept of the constitutional authority of monarchs. Many of his historical plays, from Richard II to Henry IV, Henry V, Macbeth, King Lear, they are highly descriptive of the behaviors that separate the good king from the bad king. What made for a good king? Well, it was a monarch who respected the rule of law and did not exceed the boundaries of his own authority. What made for a bad king? A monarch who cared not a whit for centuries of tradition that comprised the rule of law. I have to pause. Does that sound familiar? And acted arbitrarily and absolutely to accomplish his own selfish goals without any regard for the rights and privileges customarily enjoyed by all of his subjects. Now, Shakespeare's play, where he talked about this, Henry V, first performed in London, England, around 1599. Now, this was during the last years of Elizabeth's reign, but he was thinking about what distinguished a good king from a bad king. Now, to him, Henry V became a good king. He assumed the throne at a young age when his father died, and he rose to greatness. Why? Because he exercised bold leadership, but at all times he kept the interests of the entire country in mind, in his heart. And all of the citizens were at the forefront of his thoughts at all time. Now, he answered that call most notably on a very important day. Those of you remember your English literature, this will probably ring a bell, either in high school or in college. Now, this was almost 2 centuries before Shakespeare wrote. Shakespeare was writing Elizabeth I, James I, late 1500s, early 1600s. Shakespeare then was writing of an event that took place almost 2 centuries ago, prior to that, rather, in 1415. And this event was Henry V's defining moment, the epitome, if you will, of the good king. Let me set the stage. War between France and England. Henry V, the young English king, has taken a small, overmatched army into France. A much larger French army awaits in the nearby city of Agincourt, and they plan to wipe out the entire English army that day. It is October 25th, 1415. It's an old English holy day that was known as the Feast of St. Crispin. St. Crispin was a 3rd century Briton who was a Christian martyr. This was still at the time they were persecuting. He wouldn't renounce his faith. They captured him, executed him in a rather gruesome way, and he was a martyr. On that morning, October 25th, 1415, Agincourt, France, in the hours before the coming battle, in which his outnumbered English troops would face a large French force on their home territory, Henry V spoke to his troops about what they were about to do. And this is what he said. I'll do my Shakespeare now. You'll recognize these phrases because they come back, they resonate. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. One of the most famous motivational speeches in history. And that day at Agincourt, Henry V and his outnumbered English troops won a great victory. And it was a tribute to what the focused effort of a small group of dedicated patriots can accomplish. Now, the Tea Party movement began with that same kind of focused effort. Now, we thought we were a small group when it started, but it turns out that we are the majority of our fellow countrymen. What's small, and you'll all recognize this, is not our size and numbers, but our financial resources. Am I right? We've done this as some of my friends say, we financed this Tea Party movement in the change we found in the couch. We are everyday middle-class people. But let's be clear, our resource is not our money. Our resource is time and energy. Now, you've all given much of your time to the cause of liberty over the past 3.5 years. I am here to tell you that over the next 110 days, the country needs you to give even more time. Search your calendar. Find that extra time. Make the commitment. Make it tonight. If you were to ask a typical Tea Partier what two components of our covenant, our constitutional covenant, our covenant of liberty, what two components are most important, they would tell you, I would think, Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates and limits the powers of Congress and the federal government, limits the powers of the states. And the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights that was promised at the convention, the promise honored by James Madison when he was elected to the House of Representatives, and passed by the states and ratified by 1791, those 10 amendments, those critical amendments, guarantee our civil liberties, our individual liberties. When I talk now about this covenant, the covenant that binds us, that we all agreed to at that time, and that we, by being citizens today, still participate in and still voluntarily agree to participate in, I am talking not only of the Constitution, I'm talking of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that we freely entered into. And we entered it into in a very elaborate process. The framers in Philadelphia, they developed the Constitution and they signed it. And they were smart. They didn't send it to the Constitutional Congress. Where did they do? They sent it to the state legislatures and said, let the people decide. Let us hold in every one of these states a constitutional convention and let us debate what it means. And those constitutional conventions, your ancestors, I'm sure, many of your ancestors not only voted, some probably served in those constitutional ratification conventions. And you know what they debated there? They didn't debate what somebody's intent was in the Constitution. They debated the plain meaning of the words, and that is our covenant. Our covenant is not what some judge invents. Our covenant is the plain meaning of the words, and that process from the start of the convention in May of 1787 till the acceptance by all states and the ratification of the 10 amendments, that process was a 4-year process. And it was long, and it was arduous, but it was the people governing and the people consenting. And so that is the basis upon which our covenant arose. But what happened? Why did the Tea Party movement have to come about? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the political class of the United States, in the form of the members of the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branches of the government, they broke 4 promises of that covenant, thereby accelerating the natural tendency to centralize and consolidate power. What were those promises? I'll run through them quickly, but just remember, each broken promise took away liberty. And it took 4 promises to be broken before the people arose. But we have arisen, and we will not stop until this is restored. So the first promise, thank you. So let me tell you, the first promise to abide by the written words of the Constitution, we just talked about that, the plain meaning. I'm sorry to say it was broken before the ink was dry on the last documents that sealed our uniquely American covenant contained in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it was broken by the fellow on the $10 bill, Alexander Hamilton. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret. Those of you who've studied this know. Alexander Hamilton did not believe in the covenant. He was basically a quasi-monarchist. In fact, he gave a speech, y'all know this. He gave a speech at the Constitutional Convention where he essentially advocated a quasi-monarchy and landed like a lead balloon. He gave the speech in July. He left the convention for 2 months because he knew they wouldn't put up with that, and he came back just at the end. So he was always looking for ways to get around the covenant. Now, he had many great talents, but faithfulness to the covenant was not one of those talents. So Hamilton wanted a federally chartered national bank, even though the Constitution did not authorize the Congress to charter corporations. Now, was this a good idea? You know, it probably wasn't a bad idea at all, because we did need a national bank or some financial capability. We ended up using it, by the way, to do the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So there was merit to the idea, but the Constitution, our covenant, didn't authorize it. What did Hamilton do? What would somebody do who believed in the covenant? Well, it'd be very easy. Looking back in retrospect, he could have asked for an amendment to the Constitution, the 11th Amendment, authorizing Congress to charter a bank, and he probably would have won it. But he didn't believe in the covenant, really. And this is the first time we had a problem. He came up with this interpretation of the Constitution. Have you heard that before? He found something in the Constitution that the framers didn't intend. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. Well, the Necessary and Proper Clause basically, as Hamilton saw it, was anything I want to do. And he used that to get Congress to pass the bank bill, and he persuaded President Washington to sign it, and we had a national bank. And so the first promise was broken. The second promise, to refrain from interfering in private economic matters, was broken when the modern party that routinely pays homage to free markets first came to power. I speak of the Republican Party, that now, through our efforts, however, is being held to account on promises of free markets. But in 1862, a Republican Congress and administration passed the Pacific Railway Act, which subsidized 2 private companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, to the tune of $60 million to build a transcontinental railroad. Now, this is a good idea, right? Well, building a transcontinental railroad was a good idea, but you know, a lot of people think a free market could have done it instead of a subsidized government program. Well, it enriched the private founders of those companies. Why wouldn't it? Not only did they get $60 million of subsidies, they stole $23 million of it. And in addition to that, the quality of the railroad they built was so poor that within 5 years of the hitting of the spike in 1869, Promontory Point, Utah, virtually every single mile of that track had to be rebuilt. Not a particularly, this is the first time people might have gotten a clue that crony capitalism is a bad idea. We still have it today, and it's worse. Now, the third promise, this is very important to think about, is to honor the customs, traditions, and principles that make up the fiscal constitution. It was broken by Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, little surprise there, 143 years after the Constitution was ratified. The notion that a fiscal constitution existed was commonly accepted by all the founding fathers. From 1789 until 1931, American political leaders had uniformly observed the principle that the finances of the federal government should be managed by the same norms of prudent conduct that apply to private budgets. In other words, you know, run the government like you run your household, and don't spend money on a program unless you can identify a tax source of revenue, not debt, tax source of revenue to fund it. Well, The framers of the Constitution, the delegates to the state ratification conventions, the state legislators who ratified the Bill of Rights, and the voters, your ancestors, who elected them, stood shoulder to shoulder on these principles. And with the exception of times of war, this fiscal constitution constrained the conduct of politicians, whose natural inclinations, let's face it, are to pander to those groups that will elect them to office. It was so effective that between 1789 and 1931, federal expenditures as a percentage of gross domestic product during times of peace remained steadily between 2% and 4%. Let me repeat that. 2% and 4%. Okay? That's not a misprint. Then came the Depression, Herbert Hoover, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, in 1931, egged on by the academics, Hoover tried to spend his way out of the Depression. And he authorized vast public works that increased federal expenditures to 8% of the gross domestic product. It didn't work then. It doesn't work now. Franklin Roosevelt trounced him in 1932, in part by calling him a big spender, and promptly spent even more on public works, and then he threw in direct payments to people. By 1940, he had increased spending to 10% of GDP. Then along came Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, and we had what I call the Great Big Spending Society. And federal spending jumped to 18% of gross domestic product. But hey, the Republicans don't have clean hands on this one, because George W. Bush, by the end of his second term, federal spending as a percentage of gross domestic product was 20%. Under Obama, that number, with no constraints, really, has skyrocketed to 24% of GDP. And I can tell you, if he were to have a second term, that number would easily be 30%, and America would look like the most pathetic economic basket cases of Europe. I'm talking Greece with riots in the streets, Spain, and Italy. Countries whose economies and governments just don't work. And I haven't even talked about how far the debt has gone up. But you know, it's astronomical right now. This is financially reckless extremism. The founders, even Alexander Hamilton, especially Alexander Hamilton, would despise and detest this. 12% of the GDP is where I think it ought to be. Now, you know, the Republican establishment says it's 24%. Let's move it back to 22%. Woo! That's really going to make a difference. Look, here's the way it works. If you shoot for 22%, you're never going to get there. If you shoot for 12%, you're going to get somewhere between 12% and 22%, but you're going to be closer to 12%. And when do you need to do it? You need to do it right now. Now, had not the fourth and final promise, at least at the time that we have another promise that's been broken since I wrote the book. The fourth promise, that members of the legislative branch would exercise thoughtful deliberation while giving respectful consideration to the views of their constituents, had that not been broken in such a disdainful and audacious manner in January and February of 2009, we grassroots activists would not have, that have been come to be known as the, we would not have been compelled to action. But we were. You know, it's sort of like that story about the frog. If you turn up the frog in the hot water, you turn it up 1 degree at a time, it dies. What happened with the stimulus package? They dumped us into scalding water, and we jumped out, and we're not going back in. But now, as I mentioned, you know, we've passed the midpoint of 2012, and I am very sorry to say, a fifth promise of the Constitution has been broken by the Supreme Court. And there, and I use this term advisedly, a faithless Chief Justice has redefined his role as chief sophist And he's redefined the court's role, not as merely a judicial body, but instead as an overarching super legislative body that can rewrite the laws of Congress so as to call an individual mandate that no one ever called anything other than an individual mandate a tax. The Congress, the President, in passing this, denied that it was a tax. But Justice Roberts knew he was conjuring up a decision that would make the American people retch. But judicial activism to limit the power of the individual and extend the powers of the federal government has been going on since the Supreme Court first caved to FDR's power grab in a series of capitulations in the 30s and 40s that culminated in the odious 1942 decision, Wickard v. Filburn. If you've not heard of Wickard v. Filburn, it is the most outrageous extension of the Commerce Clause, one that perhaps only a descendant of Alexander Hamilton could come up with. And essentially what it said is the Department of Agriculture could tell a farmer in Ohio who wanted to use 11 acres to grow wheat that he'd use for himself and feed his chickens, they told him he couldn't do it. And the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, he can't do that. You know, he can't build that farm. He didn't build that farm. These themes keep coming back. These themes keep coming back, don't you? Now comes this equally odious, and the decision is called National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius, the Secretary of HHS. Roberts rewrote the law from the bench. He wasn't writing a legal opinion. He offered a political solution. More importantly, and this is why what we do is so important, he just told us which team he's playing on. He's with the anti-constitutionalists. His legacy is to be their champion, not ours. The legislative history of this Obamacare Act is clear. The only thing about that law that originated in the House of Representatives, and remember now, if it's a tax, Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 says revenue bills must originate in the House of Representatives. That's called the Origination Clause. The only thing about that law that originated in the House was the bill number. This is true. On September 17, 2009, Congressman Charlie Rangel introduced a bill, H.R. 3590, which he called, you ready for this? Is so related to health care. He called it the Service Members Home Ownership Tax Act of 2009. Its purpose was to, quote, amend the Internal Revenue Code to modify the first-time homebuyer's credit in the case of members of the armed forces. It passed the House unanimously in October by a 416-0 vote. Well, guess what Harry Reid did? Because he didn't want to go to a conference committee, which every other major bill goes through for centuries. On November 19th of 2009 rather, Harry Reid introduced his own version of H.R. 3590 in the Senate. This is what they call a shell bill. He took the bill that had passed unanimously in the House. He stripped of it all its content. He took it out. And in its place, he put in the first Senate version of Obamacare with the tax. Where did that tax originate? In the Senate. Is that not unconstitutional? It is unconstitutional. Now, in effect, Justice Roberts became the second con artist in a two-man bait-and-switch scam. Had President Obama called the individual mandate a tax prior to its voting, it simply would not have passed. It would not have become law. After all, it only became law by the barest of margins, using the most deceptive of techniques. Justice Roberts effectively announced that the federal government had been kidding on all along. Of course, the individual mandate was a tax. We just didn't know it until he thought of it in his mind. Now, we have a message for President Obama, for Chief Justice Roberts, and the array of Democratic political hacks temporarily braying over this Pyrrhic victory. The people will throw Obama and the Democrats in Congress out in November. This Supreme Court decision confirms what we have known all along. The biggest lawbreaker in the land in this last year of the Obama administration is the federal government. I see everybody, and because you can think of all of the examples. Take, for instance, the Internal Revenue Service. Did you see the report the other day that said they did a study of seizures of property undertaken by the Internal Revenue Service? And they found that 22% of those seizures violated the law. But as Glenn Reynolds, the Instapundit blogger, says, you know, laws are just for the little people. Take what's going on in the EPA. You know, out in Idaho, there's a family that's wanted to build, and they had a particular little issue of some wetland. The EPA said this should be a wetland. And they said, you're nuts. This isn't a wetland. We just want to build here. Well, the EPA, you know, took them to court. The couple won. Guess what the EPA did after the couple won the court decision? They're going to try and take it anyways. But, as I said, laws are just for little people. And take, of course, that famous, infamous 2005 Supreme Court decision, Kelo v. New London. A woman in New London had worked all her life to have a pretty little pink house. But it lay in an area that a developer coveted. And so he went to his buddies on the city council, and they took that land by eminent domain. And the wrecking ball came and crushed this woman's house, and the developer never built a building on that land. But the court said that was okay. After all, the laws are just for the little people. And then, of course, there is President Obama, and we could be here all night if I went through this list. But I'll take the most recent. You know, the 1921 Budget and Control Act says the president will give the annual budget to Congress by February 1st. In 4 years, he's missed that deadline 3 times. But it gets better. The 1970 Legislative Reorganization Act says you'll give a mid-session review to Congress by July 16th. In 4 years, guess how many times President Obama has complied with that law? 0! But, after all, laws are just for the little people. Now, I began this address by talking about Shakespeare's idea of a good king, and that was Henry V, who knew that the laws were not just for the little people, they were for all the people, and especially for the king. Now, I want to close by talking about how Shakespeare dealt with a bad king, Richard II, and how that king's dying regrets are an important warning to all of us sitting in this room tonight. Let me set the stage here. The play itself was written and performed after Henry V, a couple years, in 1601, just 2 years before the death of Elizabeth I, and 2 years before the coronation of that proponent of the divine right of kings and enemy of the English Constitution, James I. Historically, Shakespeare was describing events from a little more than 2 centuries before that time, when Henry V's father, who was called Henry Bolingbroke, deposed the bad king Richard II. Now, in fairness to Richard II, it wasn't clear from the beginning of his reign that he would become a bad king. He was intelligent, but he was weak. He wasn't faithful to what even then was known as the English Constitution. Richard finds himself mired in a war in Ireland and in need of money. When Henry Bolingbroke's father dies, Richard flaunts the rule of law and the English Constitution, and by royal decree takes all of Henry Bolingbroke's inheritance away from him. Bolingbroke did not like this, nor did many of the other nobles who had been treated this way many times by Richard II. They rebelled. They defeated him. They captured him. Henry imprisoned him in the Tower of London, and Henry was crowned the new king, Henry IV. It is there in the Tower of London that we find Richard II. Nearby, one of his favorite musicians is actually playing one of his favorite songs. We don't know if it's a lyre or a flute, but you can imagine some early, late medieval song being played. And Richard usually loved to hear the song. But as he listens to the music, he chides himself for squandering the opportunity to serve his country during what is now his ended reign as king. And I'll do Richard II here. How sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives. And here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broke in a disordered string. But for the concord of my state, and time had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. And then, as Shakespeare writes it, Richard's time is up. Within minutes, he is no more. Where will you be when our own St. Crispin's Day Battle of Agincourt is held on Election Day 2012? Will you, like Richard II, chide yourself that you have wasted time, and now doth time waste you, not only you, but your country and your children's legacy? Or will you be one who has fought the battle to restore the good king, the good Constitution, the American Constitution? Shall you be one of the proud, the few, who gentlemen and gentlewomen asleep in their beds shall envy? How will you use your time over the next 110 days? Will you spend no more time than you currently do in activism? Or will you use every waking minute you can to advance the cause of liberty? I know where you stand, Zan. Will you join Zan and the Rainy Day Tea Party in the local Paint Florida Red project? Using your valuable minutes to talk with a voter in the key swing state of Florida, persuading to vote for our country on Election Day. How many votes will your efforts add to our margin of victory? Will it be 1? Will it be 10? Will it be 100?
Millions.
I like that. Now, I know you are tired. Most of you, like Zan, have been, and we are all sick, and we are all tired. But we are not yet done. We must finish what we started. We must give that last full measure. Lincoln described it as the sacrifice of those who died at Gettysburg, but our last full measure doesn't require our lives. It requires our time and our energy. Will you tonight make a list of your own sphere of influence? How many people do you personally know whose votes on November 6th are now uncertain? Write their names down. Call them up tomorrow. Invite them to your house for a barbecue or for a cup of coffee. This is the most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight. Take 10 minutes of their time. Look them in the eye. Tell them why it is important that they vote for the Constitution and our country on Election Day. Your sincere appeal, the appeal of their friend, their neighbor, their colleague, will influence their voting decision in November far more than any television commercial or radio spot or speech by any candidate or Tea Party leader. Don't think about it. Do it. Do it tonight. Do it tomorrow. do it every spare minute you have for the next 110 days. The secular covenant of our Constitution, earned through battle and fine-tuned by years of deliberative debate more than 2 centuries ago, requires constant attention. Its participants, like us, we must honor its terms through vigilant attention to our duties and obligations as citizens, legislators, and officials. We must be alert to the periodic need to update it and to safeguard its integrity by calling to account those who would seek to corrupt it. If we remain faithful to our inheritance and carry forward the core values of the Tea Party movement with authentic grassroots intensity over these next 110 days, the future of our country is bright indeed. I can say this tonight without hesitation. We will succeed. And my message to you tonight is to join this effort, my brothers and sisters in liberty. Rearrange your schedule. After you've secured your job and your family, drop everything. Drop everything else for the next 110 days. Find one vote, 10 votes, 100 votes more for America. Be one of those of whom your great-grandchildren will say, they restored the covenant of liberty. Thank you.